Hello and good evening, everyone. I see we still have a few more people logging in, but it looks like we've got a good number. My name's Esther Peters, and I'm the Associate Director at the Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies at the University of Chicago. And I'm excited to welcome everyone to tonight's Series of Voices with Francine Hirsch. This is an author-centered series of readings and conversations on books from or about Central and Eastern Europe, Russia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. Our long-term partner for this series is the Seminary Co-op Bookstores, the first not-for-profit bookstores whose mission is bookselling. Although their stores remain closed to the public, they are fulfilling orders and supporting book sales for virtual events like this one through their website, semcoop.com. And when you place your order, you can choose shipping, delivery to local area codes, or curbside pickup. You can find information about their upcoming events and some of our, the series upcoming events at our web pages. Those are going to be in the chat box now. This evening is, in fact, the last Series of Voices of 2020, but we will be returning in 2021. Please keep an eye on our webpage and the Seminary Co-op's webpage for details about events with Olga Levshin and Dominique Kirchner-Ryle in February 2021. Tonight, we will be discussing Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg, which examines the critical and unexpected role of the Soviet Union in the Nuremberg Trials. The author, Francine Hirsch, the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she teaches courses on Soviet and modern European history and the history of human rights. Her book, Empire of Nations, Ethnographic Knowledge and Making of the Soviet Union, received the Herbert Baxter Adams Prize of the American Historical Association, and her new project is on the history of the Russian-American entanglement. She'll be joined this evening in conversation by Faith Hillis, Associate Professor of Russian History at the University of Chicago. She is the author of Children of Rus, Right Bank, Ukraine, and the Invention of the Russian Nation, and the forthcoming Utopia's Discontents, Russian Immigrants and the Quest for Freedom, 1830s to 1930s. Two last notes before I turn things over to Professors Hirsch and Hillis. We will be giving away up to 10 copies of Professor Hirsch's book, Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg. So please let us know in the chat if you are interested and want to be considered eligible for one of those copies. I would like to note we can only ship to within the United States. So apologies for any international attendees this evening. And then one last note, there will be time for questions at the end of the program. You can enter those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time in the program, and we'll get to as many of those as we can this evening. So on that note, please let's welcome Professor Hirsch and Hillis, and thank you both for joining us this evening.
Okay, great.
Good evening, we're both here. Thank you, Esther, and thank you, Francine. It's great to have you here virtually at the Seminary Co-op and at the University of Chicago. And thanks to everyone joining us tonight as well. I want to begin our conversation tonight where you began the book. And you began with a wonderful anecdote of a documentary filmmaker, Soviet documentary filmmaker, named Roman Karben, arriving in Nuremberg to film the documentary that he's been directed to film. And I wanted to ask you why you chose to begin your story in this way, and what viewing the Nuremberg Trials through Karben's eyes can help us understand anew about this historic event.
Great, thanks, Faith. First, I just wanted to thank CEERES and Seminary Co-op for having me today, and you, Faith, as well, for the invitation. It's really, really delighted to be doing this. I first wanted to also set out for people, just to make sure people know that my book looks at the first of the Nuremberg Trials, also known as the International Military Tribunal, or IMT, which took place in the wake of World War II from November 1945 to October 1946 in occupied Germany. This was the only four-power Nuremberg trial, so it involved the Soviet Union, the United States, France, and Great Britain. and the defendants, Nazi leaders and organizations were being tried for conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And the subsequent Nuremberg trials were just held by the United States. And partly as a result, we have this idea of Nuremberg, right? As it's often seen through American eyes. We often read American memoirs, films like Judgement at Nuremberg, that's of one of the later Nuremberg trials. And so really that's the image that people have in their minds. And so Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg was an effort to put the Soviets back into the story using Soviet archives, but also, as you say, to shift the perspective. And I think that there are a number of things that we get when we start with someone like the filmmaker Roman Karman. I mean, first of all, the Soviets had such a dramatically different experience of the war than the United States and Britain in particular, also very different from France, but they shared some greater similarities. And when we think about, again, the Soviets and what the Soviets had suffered, we now know there was something like 27 million dead. The Soviet Union was occupied. There were just terrible atrocities, the devastation that was caused by the occupation, the destruction of agriculture, industry, culture, right? And so part of what you have with Karman is someone who'd seen all that, who had experienced all of that. He and other Soviet correspondents had been embedded with the Red Army during the war. He had been there for the liberation of some of the concentration camps. And so as he is going to Nuremberg, he carries those experiences with him. And so I think that's a really important perspective and an important way of getting in, right? The other thing more generally in terms of seeing it through Soviet eyes, and one of the ways it was really fun for me after reading all of these American memoirs to then go into the archives, right, and see these Soviet materials. And a lot of times there were these questions in the memoirs, like, what were the Soviets thinking? Well, now in some cases, I know what they were thinking, which is great. There was one instance, for example, on the eve of the trials, where the Soviets are trying to delay the start of the trials, and they say that their chief prosecutor, Roman Rudenko, that he has malaria. And so again, there's all kinds of speculation. People really don't believe this, but what did it mean? And so again, in doing the archival research, you can actually see, well, they were really behind. Like they didn't have enough translators. They were desperate for more time. And so again, it's through the Soviet vision of people like Karman, but then it's also using the Soviet archives to tell a fuller story of the Soviet contribution and also the relationship among all four countries of the prosecution, which we don't get as much of, I think, in other works.
Right, thank you. And I want to return to both of those elements, actually, the role of these artistic professionals who documented not only the war, but also the trials, and then also the question of archives, because both are really interesting elements in the book. For the moment, though, for those who haven't read the book yet, I guess its main argument is that the Soviets, or one of its main arguments, is that the Soviets originally conceived of this trial as actually a Stalinist-style show trial. So can you speak a little bit more about that, and why do they conceive of it in these terms?
So I wouldn't say so much that they're conceiving of it as a Stalinist show trial, as much as that they have their experience with trials is of a certain kind of trial, a certain kind of didactic justice, a trial in which they understand that they control the script. And I would say too, that at the start, they weren't totally out there in this understanding of what the Nuremberg trials would be, right? I mean, first of all, I think it's interesting that the Soviets were the ones who were really out there at the very beginning, pushing for what they called a special international tribunal. And they were doing so during the war even, right? In part because of what they were suffering. And the British initially, they were calling for executive judgment. They were calling basically for being shootings and hangings, right, without a trial. And the Americans during the war, they were not interested in a trial at all because, well, in part, they were worried about reprisals. And then the Americans come around afterwards to the idea of a trial. But initially, when they're talking about a trial, early on, I mean, there really is a sense that the Nazi leaders and organizations are guilty, right? And that the Soviets think that this is obvious, and they're under the impression that everyone else thinks that this is obvious as well. So the Soviets are going in expecting guilty verdicts down the line for all of the defendants, for people like, Goering, Ribbentrop, Hess, right, and so on. They're also expecting guilty verdicts for the organizations that are on trial, such as the SS and the Gestapo. And so they see this trial as an opportunity, again, to demonstrate Nazi guilt, and also to show the world how much the Soviet people have suffered, and to make all of that apparent. Now, what gets them in trouble with this is that they're actually expecting to be able to control the script. And of course they're not able to, right? And because they're expecting to be able to control the script, they make a number of decisions that they would not have made probably had that not been the expectation. First of all, the key members of the Soviet team, right? The Soviet judge, Nikitchenko, the Soviet chief prosecutor, Rudenko, the assistants, they all had roles in one way or another in the Soviet show trials of the 1930s. So again, they're being sent because of that kind of experience of being able to really, the didactic justice, to be able to show and demonstrate, right? That's why they're being sent. Rudenko doesn't know how to cross-examine, like that's just a problem later. And they also, the Soviets send them without fully telling them about things that maybe they would need to know, such as the details to the secret protocols of the Soviet-German non-aggression pact, in which Stalin and Hitler had, agreed to split up parts of Eastern Europe, right? And so again, why doesn't Rudenko need to know? Because they think that they're going to be able to control the script, because they think that the crimes, well, first of all, it's agreed that the trials will only focus on European Axis crimes. That's a given. And second of all, before the trials start, the prosecutors, at the urging actually of the US Chief Prosecutor, Robert H. Jackson, they agree that the trial will focus on, that they'll do their best, let's just say, to keep uncomfortable topics relating to the victors out of the courtroom. But what the Soviets don't understand is that the prosecutors might agree to this, but that doesn't mean that the judges are going to agree to it, and the judges clearly don't. So, so again, it's because of their ideas of what they want the trial to be, and it's also just because of the kinds of experiences that they've had in the past.
Mm-hmm. And one of the most audacious things that the Soviet prosecutors do, which you discuss in the book in great detail, and perhaps one of the ones that backfires most, is they decide to add to the indictment a charge that it was the Germans who killed the Polish officer corps in the forest of Katyn. And of course, it wasn't, right? It was the Soviets, we now know. And some of them knew, not all of them knew. What do you make of that very audacious and some might say self-defeating decision? Why would they do such a thing?
Well, again, I think this comes back to this question of what the Soviets are expecting, how they think this is going to go. And again, there are a number of things here. First of all, so in terms of Katyn, ever since like Radio Berlin announced the discovery of these burial pits in April of 1943, the Soviets and the Nazis were accusing each other of this crime. And the Soviets thought after the victory, they would finally put this to rest. And they actually had been talking about holding their own Katyn trial. And then someone in the security forces, and I don't know exactly, I would like to know more about how exactly this unfolded, decided that why not just throw it into Nuremberg, right? And so, so the war is over. They think that the defendants aren't going to be able to contest this. They don't see this as reckless because they think that they're going to be able to control the script of the trials. And it's not only that, the Nuremberg Charter, it's all the details of all the articles of the rules of the trial. There's an Article 21 in there. And Article 21 states that that the evidence presented by a national war crime, any national war crimes commission is incontrovertible. The Soviets didn't understand what incontrovertible meant, right, in this case. They thought that this meant that this evidence could not be challenged whatsoever. And so this becomes a really big thing. There's lots of desperate telegrams back and forth to Moscow about this issue. And what ultimately happens is the way that the judges explain this, and again, there are 4 judges. There's one Soviet judge, Nikitchenko, and the 3 Western judges like overrule him on a whole number of things, including this. So the Western judges say, no, incontrovertible means that you can submit this evidence, but the defense can still contest it. And so, right, what ultimately happens, of course, is that the defense is allowed to call 3 witnesses to counter this Soviet evidence, much of which was fabricated, of course. I mean, I should say, but all of it, which was fabricated. But again, that's a really long and interesting story too about how that unfolded. But they also let the Soviets bring 3 witnesses, and so that's yes, it's a low point. It's a low point. And one other thing that I'll just say about this is, so again, the Soviets add this to the indictment, which is this giant document that includes all of the charges, and then the Americans and the British and the French, they question this. They don't want to include Katyn in there. They know that whether the Soviets are guilty or not, they know this has been a political hot potato. They don't want to touch it, right? But Rudenko says that he's going to have to go back again. It's the stalling, and that I'll have to go back to Moscow and talk to Stalin, and it'll take a couple of weeks. And so, again, they're pretty sure that maybe the Soviets did it, but there's not enough firm evidence, and so they go along with it. And then, poor Jackson, it's a couple of days after the indictment is published is when he gets some information from Army intelligence, basically telling him, yeah, we're pretty sure that the Soviets did it. And at that point, the indictment's been published. Yeah.
And I think on this theme of things not going to plan, you also had a little bit of the book that you wanted to read as well.
Oh, sure. So that is, okay, so this is my, the reading about Andrei Vyshinsky. And what I'll say again about Andrei Vyshinsky, so Andrei Vyshinsky was Deputy Foreign Minister of the Soviet Union, but he was most known in the Soviet Union and more generally for having prosecuted the Moscow trials, so the show trials in the 1930s. And so the other thing is that, again, in terms of how the Soviets think that they're going to be able to control their delegation, right, in Nuremberg, the delegation in Nuremberg is supposed to send all information back to Moscow for approval. And Andrei Vyshinsky is the head of a secret commission. It's a secret Nuremberg commission that is supposed to be helping to oversee things from afar. And so, so let me set the scene for this reading. So the Nuremberg trials have started on November 20th, 1945, and a week in, things already are not going according to plan for the Soviets. There are all kinds of problems. There aren't enough translators and interpreters, and I can't even tell you this is just such a huge problem for them. There's a sense that the US Chief Prosecutor, Jackson, is trying to take over the bulk of the case, which is absolutely true. And there are rumors that the defense was looking to introduce evidence implicating the Soviet Union in war crimes and in crimes against peace. And this is an excerpt from chapter 5. Okay. On Sunday, November 25th, Andrei Vyshinsky came to town. His arrival created a state of heightened alert among the members of the Soviet delegation. The Soviet prosecutors and judges all knew that they were in Nuremberg to do Vyshinsky's bidding and that their fates rested in his hands. Even the Western prosecutors were stirred up. According to the US Assistant Prosecutor Telford Taylor, the US delegation had regarded Vyshinsky as an ominous figure because of his role in the Moscow trials. Everyone eyed him with curiosity. What exactly was his business? How would he behave? Vyshinsky had come to Nuremberg primarily to ensure that the Soviet prosecution successfully repelled a push for the tribunal to consider highly sensitive evidence about the German-Soviet non-aggression pact. The instigator of this request was Alfred Seidel, the defense attorney for Hans Frank, a former member of the Nazi Party, who claimed to have dug up some documents about the pact's secret protocols. These secret protocols, in which Hitler and Stalin had plotted out the conquest and division of a large part of Eastern Europe, implicated the Soviets in a crime against peace. The evening after his arrival, Vyshinsky called a meeting with the members of the Soviet delegation. Many issues were discussed. At the end of the meeting, Vyshinsky broached the most sensitive issue of all, a request made by Jackson. A few weeks earlier, Jackson had asked his British, French, and Soviet colleagues to write up secret memoranda detailing their country's war crimes in anticipation of potential allegations from the defense. And this is what I had mentioned earlier, right? Back in Moscow, Soviet leaders had put their own spin on Jackson's request. Without admitting to any wrongdoing, they had made a list of taboo topics that they wanted kept out of the courtroom. Vyshinsky now presented this list to the Soviet delegation. Not surprisingly, this highly secret list, which had been typed out on a single sheet of paper, included a number of items about Soviet-German relations, including the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939 and all questions relating to it. I kind of love this because the all questions, of course, is the secret protocols, right? Molotov's visit to Berlin and Ribbentrop's visit to Moscow. It also included more general topics, including Soviet-Polish relations. Vyshinsky now ordered Soviet Chief Prosecutor Roman Rudenko to reach a verbal agreement with the French, British, and American prosecutors to steer clear of questions that their countries did not want raised by the accused. He also instructed Rudenko to get the other prosecutors to agree that they would review each other's evidence before it was submitted to the tribunal. Now, Rudenko was to oppose the submission of any documents that were harmful, of course, to Soviet interests. Vyshinsky did not give Rudenko permission to share a physical copy of the Soviet taboo list with any of the Western prosecutors. Once a copy was in circulation, the Soviets would lose the shield of plausible deniability. Now, Vyshinsky's visit was an occasion, even to those who were unaware of his direct involvement with the trials and knew him only as a Soviet dignitary. Jackson gave a dinner at the Grand Hotel in his honor. Vyshinsky went there directly from his meeting with the Soviet delegation, still peeved at Jackson. At one point in the evening, Vyshinsky rose and proposed a toast to the defendants. May their paths lead straight from the courthouse to the grave. Everyone had drained their glasses before the translation was finished, and the American judges were appalled to hear that they had drunk to the deaths of the accused. This was perhaps the only time the Soviets did not mind the sluggish pace of interpretation from Russian into English. Vyshinsky visibly enjoyed the moment. So that's, yeah, that's one of my favorite moments of the more lighthearted bits.
I love that scene of the dinner brings us to where we were going next, because one of the really fun things about this book is it's not just the courtroom drama, and the courtroom drama is very good, don't get me wrong, but there's also all this behind the scenes stuff going on, right? So the dinners, cocktail parties, we even have the unexpected pool party appear here. So yes. What role did you assign these kind of social events and behind the scenes events in the unfolding of the trial itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the behind the scenes, well, first of all, let me say that's some of my favorite materials. I mean, part of why I knew that I wanted to work on this project after starting to do the research was starting to find some of these accounts, right, about what was going on behind the scenes. And again, it's Nikitchenko playing tennis. It's going to vaudeville shows at the Grand Hotel. It's and part of why we know about this, I mean, there are memoirs, of course, but there's also the Soviets are all sort of surveilling each other. They're following each other and writing reports up from Moscow about what they're doing. So that's one side of this. And so that's part of like how we have some of this, right? In terms of the actual how it works, I think that, again, when we think about international relations, we don't always think about the parties as being part of what pushes things forward. I certainly don't think that's the case in most of the narratives that we have of the Nuremberg trials. But I think that they were absolutely critical, especially once you start looking at the trials in terms of four-power relations, right? Four-power relations, which could get incredibly tense at times, and sometimes a lot of alcohol could really go a long way. So the moment, one of the episodes that in the reading, when Vyshinsky tells Rudenko, for example, to reach an agreement with the other countries of the prosecution about the circulation of evidence and sharing evidence ahead of time, Rudenko gets them to agree after a couple of nights of really drunken parties, right? And so part of how, again, like how do I know this is because there are telegrams that are sent back to Moscow in which this is basically explained that Rudenko had been to parties, and as a result of this, that this everything is set, it's all good. So those are some of the moments I think that that worked well for the Soviets. There are other things too. I think because of the language barrier, right? And because of a cultural barrier as well, and because the Soviets were really not supposed to socialize very much with the other delegations, except for at these more formal occasions. There are a lot of moments where the Americans and the British and the French are getting together. I mean, there's a really interesting moment before the trials start, even when they're in London and working on the Nuremberg Charter, where the Soviets arrive late. And for days now, for several days, like Jackson and Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, who ends up being the main person in the British prosecution, and Robert Falco from the French, like they're going to dog races and drinking, and so it's hard for the Soviets to break in at that moment. The other moment that I'll mention that I think is also really critical is towards the very end of the trial with the judgment, which does not go the way that the Soviets are thinking it's going to go and hoping it's going to go. And it becomes very, very tense at the end. And I think it's because of the relationship that Nikitchenko had formed with the other judges, in part playing tennis, in part at pool parties, right? In part, again, just at all of these informal occasions, that I think that's really what kept things from falling apart. So yeah, so I think in some ways it's color, right? In some ways, for me, it's also a story about the Soviets, like, and kind of the risks that they're taking in this new environment, like going to shopping on the black market and having love affairs, and like what does that mean? What does that look like? And what does Moscow make of it? It's the Soviet Union now in the wider world. But then in part, it is also about how important those kinds of moments are to keeping things on track. But yeah, but that's the really fun material.
It's also really auspicious for the historian to have this documentation, not only of the trial goings on, but the comings and goings of typists and translators and drivers and NKVD and everyone else. So can you talk a little bit more about your process of doing archival research and sort of how you piece this story together, where you began, and just what that was like?
Sure, it's one of my favorite things to talk about always, because I love that process of research and how in Moscow, I worked in 5 different archives, and the fun of it is, again, you start to piece the story together in different parts from the different archives and start to see it come together as a whole. So yeah, I started the research in the state archive, GARF, right, for Russianists out there, and also in the Communist Party archive. And initially, so in the state archives, there's this giant, archival fund, we call them, right? It's a big archival collection. And there's a big one on the Nuremberg trials, which, I mean, it's fine. It's the Soviet transcripts and all the official Soviet materials of the trials. But again, like what was exciting when we stuck in there, I found some of these surveillance reports back to Moscow, again, talking about just, again, the problems with translators, about how they're having a hard time just dealing with some of the informal public relations aspects of things. And informant writes that the female members of the Soviet delegation, like the typists and the stenographers, are getting made fun of by the British and the Americans for shabby clothing. So those kinds of things, and so that made it interesting, just in terms of a human perspective, right? And then also materials about witnesses, like potential witnesses, lists of potential witnesses, what would disqualify a witness, what were they looking for in a witness? So those materials were fascinating to start to put together. Then I also worked in the Academy of Sciences archive, looking at the materials of the Institute of Law. And this was also a really important part of the project for me, because part of what I was really also interested in was the role of, so again, on the one hand, you have these Soviet people like Rudenko and Nikitchenko with the show trial experience, but on the other hand, at the same time, you have these jurists, very accomplished jurists, people like Aron Trainin, who had been trained in European law, who had spent time studying throughout in Germany, actually, in the 1920s and earlier. And Trainin has a critical role in the trials and a critical role before the trials as well, putting together this report that eventually becomes a book on the criminal responsibility of the Hitlerites. Anyway, so again, looking at the putting together these materials and the draft copies and how they circulated was really interesting. It was fun, because it actually really is fun doing that kind of research. And then in the Archive of Literature and Art, those materials also were just amazing, because that's, again, where you see, you know, Roman Carmen's diaries and drafts of the speeches that Roman Carmen is going to give about the experiences of the trials, and where you get information about the food and about the living conditions, and just how, again, how they're all cramped in a room, and it's and the ventilation is terrible, and just like knowing those kinds of things, I feel like just brings you closer to being in that moment. And letters home from people like the playwright Vsevolod Vishnevsky, who is one of the Soviet special correspondents. And again, I mean, some of it's heartbreaking, because, you know, Vishnevsky talks about how, you know, in the trials, like day after day in the courtroom, he's reliving the experiences of the war. And he also talks about his just like so incredibly frustrated with the Americans who are chewing gum in the courtroom, right? Which he's just is so incredibly offensive. So again, that all kind of brings it together. And then I would say the most important archive for me was the Foreign Ministry archive. And it took quite a while to get access to that archive. I wasn't sure that I would. I'm so grateful that I eventually did. I eventually got access to it. It's so funny how this works, right? But it was like a couple of days before I was supposed to leave Moscow. That's when I was told I could go work there. And so of course my visa was still good. So I called and extended my stay. So I just could work there for a longer period. And that archive was amazing, because there, again, remember, the Soviets are smuggling back all of these documents to Moscow, like copies of the indictment, copies of the judgment. They're not supposed to, the judgment's supposed to be talked about in secret, right? And so Nikitchenko, no one's supposed to see it. The Western memoirs make so much about how they burn the papers after their discussions. And here's a copy of it, a draft copy, right, in the archive with Vyshinsky's handwriting all over it. So again, all of that is, I'm gonna take that off. Okay, so those moments. So putting together the story through these different perspectives was great. And then I also did some archival research in the U.S. and the most amazing materials there were Jackson's unpublished diaries, which again, seeing, and also Maxwell Fyfe's letters home are fabulous. And so for me, just again, seeing things from all of these different perspectives, that's, the archival research is great.
And that's one of the really unique elements of this book, seeing how the story of Stalinist high politics fits together with the story of diplomacy and the story of the arts and the story of this jurisprudence as well.
Yeah.
We're going to talk for a few more minutes, but I see some people have submitted questions over the Q&A, the chat. And I'm just going to ask if you could please resubmit your questions in Q&A, even if you already submitted in chat, because otherwise we might lose track of them. And if you haven't submitted a question yet through Q&A, now is a good time to do so, because we're going to turn to that in just a few moments. For now, though, I want to turn to another element of the book that we haven't spoken about yet. And we've talked a lot about the ways that the Soviets wanted to micromanage this and saw it as a propagandistic effort. But another element of the story that you're telling is also that the Soviets were honestly trying to bring to light these atrocities that had occurred during the war in very courageous and heartrending ways sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the most moving passages you had in the book deals with one of the witnesses who's called by the Soviet prosecutors, and that's the Yiddish poet and partisan fighter Abraham Sutzkever. Mm-hmm. So I think you wanted to speak about him a little and maybe read about him a little bit.
Yeah, I do. So that's the other reading that I have, and so part of what I want to just say also in terms of thinking about what the Soviets bring to this, and what I think has been left out of a lot of the literature is it was Soviet witness testimony and Soviet evidence that really gave an early picture of the Holocaust. And I think that sometimes that's forgotten about, right, for all kinds of reasons. And the testimony of Stutzkever and some of the other witnesses was absolutely critical for that. And again, it's complicated, right, when we talk about the Soviet role in the trials, because of Katyn, because of the secret protocols, because of, again, what we know about the Moscow trials and continuity and personnel. But yes, I mean, again, what the Soviets had experienced, what the Soviets had suffered, what they had seen, I don't think I mean, the Nuremberg trials would certainly not have had their impact had it not been for their contribution. So, so this reading, okay. So again, let me set the scene here. It's late February 1946, and the Soviet prosecution is almost done presenting its part of the case. Soviet Assistant Prosecutor Lev Smirnov is presenting on crimes against humanity. He's about to call the Yiddish poet Avraham Sutzkever to the witness box. Sutzkever and his wife, Fredka, had been interned in the ghetto in Vilna, Lithuania for the first 2 years of the war. In September 1943, they had fled and joined a group of partisans. 6 months later, in March 1944, Soviet leaders had staged a rescue operation, airlifting them out of German-occupied territory. And then Sutzkever was taken to Moscow, where he worked with the writer Ilya Ehrenberg and others to compile evidence of German atrocities against the Jews. Now, the other thing to know is that Soviet secret police agents had been screening possible witnesses for the Soviet prosecution since November 1945. And those are some of the lists I saw in the archive, and they're from potential witnesses from all over the Soviet Union. But all the while, Soviet leaders had been on the fence about sending witnesses to Nuremberg at all. They had considered having the Soviet prosecution build its case on documentary evidence alone. They made the final decision to send witnesses only in January 1946, after Rudenko went back to Moscow for the holiday break and met with Stalin. And so afterwards, a number of decisions are made about bringing in new witnesses, bringing in new evidence and also sending witnesses. They added Sutzkever, though, even later than that to the list, after French witness testimony about the concentration camps. The French testimony had been incredibly powerful, really bringing meaning to the numbers and giving voice to individual suffering. And so too with Sutzkever's testimony. And so this excerpt is from chapter 8. Okay. Avraham Sutzkever had spent a couple of fitful days and sleepless nights nervously waiting to testify. The responsibility of representing the Jewish people weighed on him heavily. Will I pass the exam? Will I fulfill my mission properly for history, for my people? God only knows, he had written in his diary. Now, before the courtroom, the poet was visibly overcome with emotion. Unlike the other witnesses, he remained standing in the witness box, as if, he later wrote, it would have been a matter of reciting Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead. Sutzkever's voice trembled and his body shook as he told the court about the operations of the Einsatzgruppen in Vilna. He described how in the autumn of 1941, the manhunters of the SD had barged into Jewish homes day and night, dragging men away to the nearby village of Ponary, most of whom were never heard from again. He also spoke of the pogrom the Germans had initiated earlier in Vilna in July 1941. Even before the Vilna ghetto was organized that August, half of the city's Jewish population had been murdered, he attested. Before the occupation, some 80,000 Jews had lived in Vilna, Sutzkever emphasized. At the end of the war, there were only 600 Jews left. Smirnov asked for a clarification. 79,400 persons were exterminated? Sutzkever answered yes. The most harrowing part of Sutzkever's testimony was his recounting of the murder of his newborn son in December 1941 by German soldiers in the ghetto hospital in Vilna. And I'll skip this because it's just way too disturbing. Sutzkever had testified for almost 40 minutes, and he was spent, shaken to the core, as he wrote in his diary. He was consumed by both his own suffering and his desire for vengeance, but also strengthened by the knowledge that the Jewish people had survived, heartened by the ardent, intense feeling that no power of darkness is able to annihilate us. He considered it a matter of Jewish destiny that he, a Yiddish poet, had survived to judge Rosenberg and Frank in Nuremberg, and through them, all who had adhered to their ideology. Sutzkever had indeed done well, speaking for the Jewish people and also testifying on behalf of the Soviet people. Smirnov, Shenin, and Zorya, three of the Soviet assistant prosecutors, all congratulated him afterwards for so ably doing his part. Sutzkever, a Jew and a partisan, served an important role for the Soviet prosecution at this point in the trials. Through his testimony, the Soviets were able to integrate the story of the annihilation of the Jews into the larger narrative about German crimes against humanity and the wartime suffering of the entire Soviet people in the occupied East. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's an amazing passage of the book. And I also recommend that people read Sutskever's poetry of this period, which is also amazing and moving. We have wonderful questions that I want to leave time to discuss. So I'm going to start wrapping us up. Fast forward a little bit to the end of the book. By the end of the book and the end of the trial, I think it's fair to say that the Cold War is already beginning to unfold in the courtroom and in the broader world. So to what extent do you see these phenomena as linked? To what extent do you see the kind of final decisions, final deliberations as part of this early Cold War history? And how do the various sides have diverging visions that are evident at this point?
Yeah, so I think, so first of all, there's tensions, and what I would even say early Cold War type tensions right from the very beginning of the trials, because again, everyone is aware of what's happening in Eastern Europe. The Soviets are carrying out deportations in Poland and Hungary, even as the tribunal is hearing evidence, right? Jackson from the very start is very unhappy about having to work with the Soviets. And so, but nonetheless, even with all that, things are kept pretty congenial in the courtroom, thanks in part to the socializing. But March really, I would say, March is what really starts to change things. So on March, I think it's the 5th, Winston Churchill, the former British Prime Minister, gives his speech in Missouri that's later known as his Iron Curtain speech. And in this speech, he calls for resistance to Soviet tyranny and aggression. And so again, he's not prime minister anymore, but he's giving that speech in the United States. The very next day in Nuremberg, the defense case starts. So that's just a crazy coincidence, but at the same time, it all feels of a piece, right? And when the Soviets get to the courtroom that day, there's all of these copies of the US Army newspaper Stars and Stripes are scattered about everywhere, with the headline, "Unite to Stop the Russians." And the defense attorneys are holding these newspapers up so that the defendants can read them. And so again, we get this image in the Soviet memoirs of walking into that particular moment and what that felt like, and how, and again, it's in the memoirs, but it's also in the letters home, it's in the other documents that there's a sense at this point in the trial that things have shifted. So one of the telegrams home say that the congenial relations among the prosecutors that have existed up until this point, right? This is no longer the case. And just the Soviets again are trying to figure out what does this mean, what's going on? And part of what happens again, because this is now the defense case and the defendants are, and the Soviets again, they didn't understand this at the start, but the defendants are able to take the stand in their own defense. They're allowed to call witnesses. They're allowed to contest Soviet evidence. They go on, and this is another thing, I think the judges, the Western judges, in part because they are very concerned about Soviet show trial history. They're very concerned about allegations of victor's justice. And lots of people at the time were talking about, is this victor's justice, right? That they really go out of their way to let the defendants just go on and on for weeks at a time in some cases. Now the entire prosecution is unhappy about this. So this isn't only about the Soviets, but it really affects the Soviets the most. Goering goes on and talks about how the war had been not a war of aggression, which was the charge, but a preventive war because the Soviets were planning for war. Ribbentrop testifies about the secret protocols and says that, if Germany is guilty of a crime against peace, then the Soviet Union is too, right? And so again, while things are, again, more or less can remain congenial in Nuremberg, congenial enough to bring the trials to conclusion, back in Moscow, what we get is a reading of all of these events that are going on in Nuremberg through what in retrospect now I think we would call a Cold War lens, where there's talk about an Anglo-American alliance, an Anglo-American effort to shut the Soviets out, the Western judges uniting against the Soviet Union. And so I think that the Soviets come out of this trial with a sense, again, of Cold War tensions. One of the arguments that I make in the book is that as a result of the Nuremberg trials, kind of the post-war struggle for human rights becomes completely entangled in the Cold War. And that is in part as a result of this, that just even afterwards, some of this language, crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, right, genocide, even as the trials are going on, it's not just the Nazis who are being accused of it, but there's accusations that the Soviets are guilty of this as well. And this just becomes part of the politics that follow.
So this, by the end, becomes a story much bigger than Nuremberg, right?
Much bigger, yeah.
Human rights.
Exactly. That's how I end the book, with the chapter that goes beyond the Nuremberg trials to look at, again, this questions about international law and human rights, and how, again, because the three main charges at Nuremberg are crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And after the trial, there's talk about these as being part of these Nuremberg principles that will be the foundation for a new international law and a new international criminal court. And so there's all kinds of things that happen afterwards in the United Nations, and yeah.
We're going to turn to some of the questions now, and
okay.
I noticed that some of them group together, so I'm going to try to treat them as such. You've elucidated just now about the kinds of crimes or ideas of crimes that were put forward, but there were some questions about categories of crimes and different understandings of what the nature of the wartime crimes were. So Jadwiga, hi Jadwiga, asks, I was wondering if the author could comment on the Soviet idea of crime criminality employed and how much this was contested with Western counterparts. And then we had a second question in a similar vein, from Zach. Due to the vast scale and immense damage of the German crimes, what incidents did the Soviet authorities bring to the trial? Was it examples of the worst types of atrocity or ones that could directly impact the defendants, such as accounts of slave laborers to prosecute spare?
Well, first of all, the indictment and the lists of crimes and the kinds of crimes and the amount of evidence that was brought in was incredible. I mean, there were just millions of papers of documents. And that's part of what made it so challenging in terms of translators, right? Because first of all, there was no expectation that the Nazis would have left behind this much evidence, but this evidence is there, and it's not just the Soviets, but all of the countries of the prosecution then are bringing this evidence in. The way that the way that the trial is organized, so it's organized around four main categories of charges. So conspiracy, right, is the first one. Then it's crimes against peace, which is and again, this is very controversial because before Nuremberg, there was talk of war of aggression, perhaps being a criminal offense, but not necessarily being a punishable criminal offense. And so there's a lot of technicalities around this anyway, but so crimes against peace, and then war crimes and crimes against humanity. And genocide is actually, interestingly, in Nuremberg, they talk about genocide, but as a war crime, where it will later be talked about as a crime against humanity. And so, yeah, so they bring in evidence of, I mean, just the worst possible atrocities, I'm not going to list them, but slave labor is part of it, as well as mass atrocities. And again, this I think it's one of those myths that there's not talk about specifically about crimes against the Jews, or that the Soviets don't talk about that, and that's completely not the case. In the Soviet presentations on crimes against humanity, there's a whole section that's actually focused on the crimes against the Jews. So I would say, by the way, that the entire transcript of the trials is published by Yale as part of the Avalon project. So if anyone's interested in just, it's not like reading, but going through and just, again, seeing, it's very interesting, and seeing how the case is put together and organized, and also the kinds of evidence that's brought to bear for each charge as well.
We have two other questions about, let's say, the personnel involved in their roles. So one is from Masha Belgubrovskaya, who asks, what was the role of Stalin in all of this? Is he making decisions? Is he forced to make decisions in comparison to Wyszynski and others on the ground? And then we have a second question that points in sort of the other direction from Bridget O'Keefe. I'd love to hear more about Soviet interpreters, translators, and technical staff, such as stenographers. Who were they? What were their backgrounds? Were they mobilized and behind-the-scenes work of surveilling and reporting back to Moscow about the other Soviets in serving in various roles? Did the shadow of the purges, when foreign language fluency was frequently reinterpreted as evidence of subversion and disloyalty, hang over the Soviets who served in these essential roles?
Yeah, fascinating questions. I'm not sure. I'm sure to start. They're both so interesting and fun to talk about. So the translators and the interpreters. So first of all, yes, the shadow of the purges absolutely looms over the Soviets in this regard. They are part of why they don't have enough interpreters and translators is because of so many German language specialists had been shot in the 1930s and then in the 40s as well. So they're really in trouble in that respect. And not only that, but there continues to be tension between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the NKVD, MVD later, but so the Soviet security forces. And so the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will tries to put through some foreign language teachers as the possibility of interpreters to try to fill the gap, but they're not approved. And so it's a very intense screening process. I know a little bit about it from the archives, but not as much as I would like, in part because my sense is that some of those materials are actually in files like NKVD archive. But what we do know is that some of the interpreters who are approved had already been in Germany for other reasons. So it was in some cases people who had been with the Soviet, with the Soviet wartime administration in Germany. They're then turned over to help work with the trials. Some members of the Soviet security forces actually also serve as backup translators of documents as well. Some of them knew German. Some of again, members of CEERES, which is another arm of the security forces that had brought the two Soviet defendants over. They also then are used as kind of backup interpreters during the trial too. But in terms of so we know some about them, but not as much as I would like. There's a great memoir though of one of them, of this woman, Tatiana Stupenokova, who again had more classic, what we would think was more classic interpreter translator training. And I highly recommend that memoir to anyone who speaks Russian, who reads Russian, because she gives just such an incredible sense of what it was like to be an interpreter at the trial, right? And of what it was like at those moments of revelations, right? Of when she heard about the secret protocols, right? When she heard about Katyn, right? And what she had to do to be able to translate that and kind of to suppress her own like emotions and feeling of surprise at those particular moments. So that is really, really interesting. And I know that there's someone out there whose name I don't remember at the moment, who's actually writing, I think it's a book about Soviet interpreters who's looking at Nuremberg as well. So I wait for that, wanting to know more myself. Stalin, oh my goodness. So Stalin's everywhere, right? Even when he's not, in the sense that many of the material, so the Soviets, unlike the other judges and the other prosecutors who are doing some checking back in, we know that Jackson, consulted sometimes with Truman, but it was more letting Truman know what was going on. We know that Jackson got briefings from Army intelligence and that he would check in, but it's a very different thing what the Soviets are doing. The Soviets are, they are sending, and that's why we know so much, they are sending all of this information back via Berlin to Moscow, to the Vyshinsky Commission, right? And then up the chain of command, it goes through the different security forces. A lot of times it ends with Molotov. Sometimes that's enough. But anything of great importance, including the indictment and the judgment, that goes on to Stalin. And that's part of why it all is taking so long, because they're waiting for Stalin's approval and then for things to be sent back down again and back to Nuremberg. And so that's, again, going into the archives and seeing Stalin's annotations on these documents is incredibly interesting. And also that there's a couple of moments when, during the break, the Christmas break, when Rudenko and some other members of the Soviet delegation go back to Moscow, again, like we have minimal information about this. There's a meeting log, and I know that Rudenko met with Stalin like once. I know that Konstantin Gorshtinin, who was another member of the Soviet delegation and a kind of high-ranking person in the legal world. He met with Stalin twice. And we know that after that, there would be some Politburo decisions that would involve Nuremberg. And again, the kinds of arguments and evidence that should be used, and that changes happened. So that's, again, so we see Stalin's influence absolutely throughout.
Great. The next cluster of questions dealt with the contrast between Soviet aims or perspectives and Western aims or perspectives. And the most specific variant of this question was asked by Peter Holquist, who says hello.
Hi, Peter.
And said, your presentation this evening contrasted the Soviets to the three Western powers. In what ways were there other groupings or rifts? For example, in terms of ideas or forms of justice, the French and Soviets in some ways are more similar than the British and the Americans in terms of the nature of law. Or again, your story of the Soviets at Nuremberg, not ready for prime time, having trouble with translators, sounds so much like the US delegation to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Thus, the US and the USSR in some senses are newcomers to the international gatherings, whereas the UK and the France were old hands. And he goes on to clarify further that at the London conference in 1945, the Soviets and French were very much on the same page. So I guess the question is, one question is Soviets versus Americans, and the other is Soviets versus these other clusters.
Right. So that's a great question. And absolutely. So it's not, I think by the end of the trial, it's the Soviet-American rift that becomes the most, that's what's on Moscow's mind, I would say, in terms of a sense of what's happening. But early on in 1945, especially in London, as they're working out the details of the Nuremberg Charter, as they're working out the details of the indictment, the Soviets and the French are much more closely aligned. And it's not only that, sometimes it'll be the Soviets and the French and the British who are uncomfortable with what the Americans are arguing and pushing for as well. So there are some, in terms of the world of law, there are some very practical things here. I mean, first of all, there's a question of what the indictment should look like. For the Soviets and the French, the way that would be closer to their legal systems would be to have the indictment contain like all of the evidence. And so then that goes in, and then that evidence is, and for the Americans and the British, they explain, well, no, the indictment should actually just be kind of a list of the charges, and then the evidence itself would be presented right during the trial. And what they end up with is a compromise, right? So the indictment is still incredibly long. It still includes a lot of the evidence, but everyone's allowed to bring in more evidence. And what surprises the Soviets is how much more evidence the Americans and the British end up bringing in. The Soviets think that the American and British cases will each take a few days. They each take a few months because all of this additional evidence is added and introduced in the middle of open court. So that's one of the shifts, and that affects the trial in all kinds of significant ways. There's also things having to do with the relationship between the judge and the prosecutor that are more similar between the Soviets and the French. So yes, that's absolutely the case. The issues with law and how they play out, I think that's again, becomes a little bit less important once the trials are rolling. But in terms of the framework, absolutely. And in general, so I think it's interesting, Jackson, he did not like the Soviets at all. He also really didn't like the French. And so reading Jackson's letters and reading Jackson's correspondence with Truman about this, he talks about this like at great length about how you can't trust the Soviets and the French in terms of what they did during the war, but also he's really suspicious of their idea of the law, right? And their notions. And he thinks that there's something actually corrupt about it too, which in the Soviet case, it's justifiable, but he applies the same thing to the French. Yeah.
Great. We have two more questions here that I think we have time for. So the first deals with the question of Katyn again. If you could speak a little more to this political hot potato of Katyn, and what was the reason for the superpowers' reticence to take the conversation on? Was it avoided largely because of a lack of veritable evidence and a desire to avoid blame on the Soviet end, or were there other factors involved?
Yeah, so no, that's interesting. So, I mean, first of all, the thing to remember about the Nuremberg trials is that only the European Axis powers are on trial, right? And so even if the Soviets are guilty of Katyn, Nuremberg would not be the place to try them for it. There'd be no forum to try them for it, right? This is not supposed to be about that. And so in terms of this audacious move on the Soviet part to then put Katyn into the indictment, in terms of the other interesting thing, my mind is going all kinds of directions here because there's so many interesting aspects to this. Also, it's like, who knew what when, right? And so at that moment when Katyn is being added to the indictment, we now know that American and British leaders probably knew about Katyn. Jackson, right? Maxwell Fyfe didn't. They had suspicions. They weren't certain. They wanted the trial to go on, right? That was the goal. And so at that moment, had they had conclusive evidence at that moment that the Soviets were guilty of it, then maybe it would have played out differently, but it's, one would think, but again, at that moment, that's why it goes in. The fact that the Western judges allowed the defense to call 3 witnesses about Katyn. And this took place late in the game, like at the end of the trial. So everything else wraps up. And then in July, before they break for the judges' deliberations, that's when they have these 2 days in court where the defense calls 3 witnesses and the Soviets call 3 witnesses. And at that moment, again, it's not to prove that the Soviets committed the crime because the Soviets are not on trial. But the defense witnesses are there to prove that the Soviet evidence is faulty and that they were innocent. And then the Soviets are trying to prove that their evidence is good and that the Nazi defense, right, were guilty. But at the end of all of this, it was really interesting to also just read newspaper accounts of the time and what the newspapers said about it. And it's pretty split. Some think that the Germans did well. Some think that the Soviets did well. There were, in the memoir literature, people talk about it being kind of a draw, right? And so what I would say about this is, some people think this is this terrible moment, the fact that Katyn went into the trial, that this is a horrible shame and it undermines the legitimacy of Nuremberg. I actually think it's the opposite. I think it's a shame that it went in, but the fact that the Western judges then insisted that this was something that the defense had a right to call witnesses on, and that in the end, Katyn disappears from the judgment. So the fact that it disappears from the judgment, to me, says something positive about this trial. And the moments that, the way that what the judges did, right, at key moments to make sure that, something false like this didn't go through, so.
We have just one more question, but it takes us back to the question of archival exploration, which I know is a favorite one. So we'll squeeze it in. This person asks, how did you find the attitude of the Russian authorities in helping you with your research at the archives? Helping or not helping, I don't know.
Yeah, so it's not really the Russian, right? So when you go to do research in Russia, so you have your official letters of introduction and you show up at the archives and so a thing I have to say is I did the bulk of the archival research for this book in 2005 and 2006, the research that I did in Russia, and things at that moment. I think we're more open than they have been at certain moments since then. So I know that, for example, one of the phones, one of the collections that I worked in the State Archive, I think it was 8131, that had a lot of critical material about witnesses, about the Politburo Commission, which was another secret commission that was overseeing the Nuremberg Commission. So those materials are now off limits. That font is closed, so researchers can't work in it anymore, at least for now. But so at the moment that I was there, I was able to work with those materials. And so some of it was, the timing was good, right? The archive that was the hardest to get access to work in was the Foreign Ministry Archive. And in that case, I'm not sure, if I basically kept showing up, every day I would knock on the door and just, say hello. And I don't know if that had anything to do with it or not, but once I was in the archives, the archivists were great. It's once I was in the Foreign Ministry Archive, the archivists were incredibly nice and helpful. So in whatever ways they could be. That's a funny archive, the Foreign Ministry one, because they have a guide to the archive that they keep locked under glass. And eventually they let you look at it, maybe, right? I got to look at it eventually. So so that's, archival research has, but my experience was a positive one.
Well, it shows. So thank you so much again for this wonderful and really stimulating discussion. Congratulations to those who won the 10 books.
Oh, cool.
Contacted in some capacity. And to those who haven't, I'm sorry, but you know, do go out and buy it from your favorite independent bookseller that is not Amazon. So we'll just thank you again for your time, and thank you everyone for attending, and I hope you all have a wonderful night.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for all the excellent questions. This was really just so much fun. So, all right, thanks.